There's one mistake that's been made over and over again, especially by Marvel Comics. It's making business decisions not really based on their audience or what their audience wants, but basically listening to the mob, people that don't really support their books to begin with, and then making business decisions based on what the mob is saying. This almost always blows up in their face. And we did have the Frank Castle Punisher nonsense going on, probably still going on to this day, to be completely honest, because the Punisher logo's been appropriated by police and military. We've got to get it out of there. They went and they decided to appease the mob. They got rid of Frank Castle. They tried to replace the character. It did not work out. And this is the most predictable outcome in the history of the world. Marvel are now reversing course, admitting their epic blunder that they probably should have never gotten rid of the character, and are bringing him back. Marvel Comics has announced the return of Frank Castle, the one and only Punisher, in a new 5-issue Red Band series titled Punisher Red Band, launching September 10th, 2025. This marks a sharp reversal from Castle's retirement in 2023, when Marvel wrote him out following a highly controversial arc. The new series, packaged in a polybag due to its graphic content, comes from writer Benjamin Percy and artist Julius Ohta. Percy promises a return of Frank's classic black costume and skull emblem, delivering what he calls the most violent Punisher story yet, packed with street-level carnage, relentless vengeance, and all the dark grit longtime fans have been missing. The Red Band label, typically reserved for mature content, signals Marvel's intent to fully lean into the character's roots and reestablish him as a force of brutal justice. So there you go. Frank Castle is returning as the Punisher, the one and only Punisher, because he's really the only man for the job. I think of Marvel's current crop of writers that they have, Ben Percy is amongst the better choices that they could have made. Maybe if Phil Kennedy Johnson would have been better. I can't really think of a lot of other people. Maybe a Jerry Duggan. That almost kind of fits into his wheelhouse. But they don't have a lot of writers that are really going to be out there pushing the envelope on a Punisher Red Band comic book. Ben Percy is one of those. So that's probably a smart choice. Julius Ohta, certainly not a superstar, but not a bum either. So you got a perfectly fine artist in there. This should be something worth celebrating. We will see if Marvel has completely turned off their Punisher fan base with their recent decisions, which we'll get into a little bit more on why they did this and how they tried to kind of replace Frank. But we should be celebrating Frank Castle returning. I can see people being very hesitant to really buy into all this kind of stuff because what Jason Aaron did to the Punisher character was pretty unforgivable. I could see a lot of people being like, you know what? Fuck that. I am not along for this one. And it's kind of interesting. It appears that Red Label has now replaced like the Max line of comic books. If it's mature and going to have extra violence in it, it's going to be a Red Band. I think I said Red Label, Red Band comic book rather than a Max comic book. I do think Ben Percy saying this is going to be like one of the most violent or the most violent Punisher stories of all time is going to be really hard to back up. Although, admittedly, he did say that with his Sabretooth War storyline, saying this is going to be the most violent, Wolverine book of all time. It did feature Sabretooth ripping Wolverine's son apart and spelling happy birthday with his body parts. So it wasn't exactly a kid-friendly comic book, and I imagine he'll be bringing the violence, but Garth Ennis has really made his mark with that Punisher character and bringing, excess amounts of violence. I think recently we saw people skinned alive in a Punisher comic book in the recent Garth Ennis Punisher Nick Fury crossover. I think Nick Fury might have killed somebody with their own entrails. Like, there's some pretty violent stuff when it comes to Punisher comic books in the past. So I don't know if you want to be making statements like that because it's going to be very difficult to back up, providing things that are even more violent than what Garth Ennis has done that Marvel are actually going to be willing to actually print. Punisher Red Band #1 kicks off with Frank Castle reemerging in New York City with no memory of who he is, but an unstoppable thirst for vengeance. This new status quo places Frank back in his iconic skull emblazoned gear, navigating a violent criminal underworld as he hunts for answers. Percy teases that Frank's amnesia will drive a story of rediscovery, blending classic Punisher themes with a raw, no-holds-barred approach. Fans can expect returning villains, new threats, and graphic confrontations that justify the Red Band format. Notably, this also closes the door on Frank's previous Weird World exile, where he had abandoned his war on crime to protect a group of displaced children, signaling that Marvel is done softening the Punisher and ready to bring back the version fans recognize. That would be the interesting part, because a lot of what Jason Aaron did was very damaging, and it was meant to last. It wasn't meant to be something that you could just retcon out of existence. He went back to his very early history, before he was ever the Punisher or even an adult, showing that he was a serial killer at like 8 years old. He also went and showed that he was a really terrible father and that his children were just totally frightened of him and that he was a terrible husband. Kind of messes up the origin of Frank Castle, the Punisher, the man set on vengeance because he was avenging the death of his family, and that's why he's so violent. That's not what it is. He kind of recontextualized that. And then, of course, the coup de grace, when his wife was murdered on the streets, the next day she was ready to file for divorce. She was going to take the children because he was just such a bad guy, and that everything that the Punisher stood for and was fighting for all of these years was complete bullshit. That was the point of the comic book, and it was very successful. And it doesn't sound like they're going to do the Bobby Ewing, he just wakes up on a couch and was, whoa, that was a bad dream type of thing. He's going to try and undo it. So that is going to be an enormous task when it comes to Ben Percy trying to make this stuff work. Punisher waking up with amnesia, no memory of who he is or why he wants vengeance, just not wanting it, and kind of putting the pieces together of what his life was. How much of that Jason Aaron stuff are they going to have to shove back in there? Are they just going to memory hole it? That's probably the smartest thing that they could do, to be completely honest. But it sounds like with the status quo they were giving, just noping out of Weird World altogether and be like, you know what? Fuck that. I don't even want to have to deal with that. He's waking up with amnesia, and getting back to the fight on the streets in New York City is probably the more sensible, logical way to do it. You can't just whole cloth undo everything Jason Aaron did, unfortunately. But if Ben Percy is worth his salt and worth the money that Marvel's paying him, by the time he's done with these just 5 issues of Punisher Red Band, he will have undone or mitigated some of the long-term damage that Jason Aaron was able to do to the character along the way. Now, why did that all happen? Frank Castle's temporary retirement was largely driven by mounting public pressure over his iconic skull logo, which they claim had been appropriated by various activists and political groups. Some far-left voices labeled the symbol problematic, especially when adopted by law enforcement or military personnel. Despite little evidence connecting Frank Castle's fictional persona to real-world politics, Marvel responded by phasing him out in 2023. In his final arc, Frank was portrayed as leaving Earth entirely after becoming the leader of the Hand, swapping guns for swords in a mythical story arc that alienated many fans. While some applauded Marvel's move as socially conscious, others viewed it as a hollow concession to media outrage and a distortion of the character's core identity. And I guess in some ways, maybe I'm part of the problem on this one, because I did, get deployed a couple of times. We minted a coin and had a fucking Punisher logo on it because it's good. It's definitely something that's been adopted by the military and police as a symbol that kind of represents, the brotherhood, whether it be a soldier or an airman or a Marine or a police officer or something of that nature. And this just got everybody's panties in a bunch for a really long time. Oh, it's been appropriated. The Punisher symbol no longer, represents the character in the comic book. It represents the alt-right Nazis or whatever it is they like to say all the time. And they bought into it hook, line, and sinker. But so many of these stupid media companies are just so scared, or at least they were so scared at one point, to ever have something that could be co-opted or represent something outside of themselves that people have deemed, toxic or whatever buzzwords going on at the time. And they kind of fell into it hook, line, and sinker. Me personally, I think you don't really accomplish much removing the Punisher logo and the Punisher character from Marvel Comics, because most of the people that are wearing that Punisher logo, whether they be in the police or the military, they don't support the comic book anyway. So it's not like you're alienating those people. Like, they're not going to stop using it. They're using it because it looks cool. No matter what they do, that logo will always look badass. And it will be forever something that kind of represents that brotherhood that people have. But I guess they needed to do it to make a point. I guess the point was they wanted to lose money and then a couple of years later be like, you know what? We totally fucked up. We're going to undo that immediately, which was basically the only outcome we were ever going to get with this. Now, they did try to replace the character in a hilarious manner, because in place of Frank, Marvel launched a new Punisher series starring Joe Garrison, a former S.H.I.E.L.D. agent driven by a familiar tragedy, written by David Pepose. Garrison's story began with promise but quickly faltered. He wielded futuristic weapons, sported a redesigned Skull logo, and carried a high-tech espionage vibe, but never connected with longtime readers. The series ran for only 4 issues before being canceled due to weak sales and widespread fan disinterest. Many viewed Garrison as a shallow attempt to sideline Frank Castle without understanding what made the Punisher resonate in the first place. That failure has now cleared the path for Castle's return, an admission, whether Marvel says it out loud or not, that you simply can't replace the Punisher. And I do feel bad for David Pepose, because they did kind of screw him over. I guess they had offered him a couple of ideas. He didn't like any of them, and he thought, hey, if I keep turning down every offer that Marvel makes to me, they'll stop offering. I guess I need to take this one. And unfortunately, he chose the Punisher relaunch. And it was just like a thinly disguised like copy of Frank with a new, logo and maybe some more high-tech weaponry, but all the same elements essentially were there. His family was killed from him. He had the person in the ear and all that kind of stuff. And there was nothing really interesting to it. And plus, everyone was already mad at Marvel because they knew why Jason Aaron had done what he did on behalf of Marvel Comics, to give in to the outrage and all that kind of stuff. And the character just never worked. And it probably set David Pepose's career back like a year or something like that. Thankfully, he has gotten Space Ghost now, which is a fantastic comic book. But him trying to defend the undefensible Joe Garrison as the Punisher as some type of replacement character did alienate a lot of people. I still know people that won't read his comic books just because, not because of the book. I don't think they blame that on him, but he obviously was taking a lot of crap from people, and you need to become a little bit of an asshole about it. Me personally, I don't hold that against him. I think Marvel screwed him over, but some people still hold it against him. He does have a good Cable 11 Chrome miniseries going on right now as well. So hopefully people are kind of coming around and willing to forgive David Pepose, because I personally don't blame him at all. I blame Marvel leadership. They're the ones that greenlit the code red on Frank Castle and what Jason Aaron did. They're the ones that came up with the stupid idea to replace the character, as if Punisher is popular because he's called Punisher, not because he's Frank Castle and the history that comes along with the character. They thought they could have their cake and eat it too, which just wasn't the case. And obviously they've come back, with their tail between their legs, basically admitting defeat, waving the white flag on this one. But they did also screw over David Pepose, in the process of doing that, when they probably should have just given him, I don't know, a real fucking Punisher series and said, hey, this Jason Aaron guy did something that we probably shouldn't have done. Let's see if we can fix it. Now we're doing that exact same thing a couple of years later, and we will see what happens. I hope that this is a good series. Of all the writers that Marvel has, they could have put on the book, Ben Percy is fine. He's not a great writer. I don't think he's ever wrote something that in 20 years we'll be talking about, but he's not a bad writer either. He can write a decent comic book, and I think there's a chance, if Marvel don't put too many restrictions on him, that maybe he could make this work. Now, we don't know the rules or restrictions that have been put on him. I don't think Marvel is just being like, you know what? After all the stuff that we went through and all the stupid decisions we make, we're just going to, wrap our arms around Frank Castle, Punisher, despite his reappearance in the MCU and Disney Plus and all that kind of stuff. I do imagine they're still going to want him to do some stuff, maybe probably talk bad about the police, maybe talk some crap about the military and stuff like that, try to equate them to the far right, stuff like that. Some of that little political messaging stuff that they like to do in modern comic books, which I don't think David Pepose will probably have a problem with. So there is certainly reason to be very hesitant and be like, you know what? I'm not going to actually put that on my pull list. I'll wait for what Wes says, or maybe another comic book reviewer out there that you trust, is going to read this book and give you the 411 and their honest opinion on whether or not it's good or not. If it's good, I'll tell you it's good. If it's bad, I'll tell you it's bad. I told everybody that the first 2 issues of Jason Aaron's Punisher were good, and I recommended them. And then once I realized exactly what he was doing, which I did suspect all along, but that he was going through with it, I was like, hey, this is an enormous red flag. And I was kind of highlighting all the stuff that he was doing to the character. And I was completely vindicated in the end, because, I don't know, maybe Wes is all right. Maybe Doc isn't right. Maybe Wes is right. So we'll see what happens with this one. If you do appreciate this kind of comic book coverage that you can really only find here on Think Critical YouTube, but you would like lots more of it, and maybe you would like to support the channel, help us keep the lights on, keep the videos coming forward, there's one place to do that. That is Thinking Critical Patreon. There's a link in the video description. There's a button right here. You get there, you find the right tier for you, and you get awesome bonus podcasts as well as all the audio tracks from all the videos here on the channel.